Hello everyone, today we talk about the German royal fisc between the 12th and the 13th century. This is a very important topic for a number of reasons, not just the elective nature of the German monarchy, but as a consequence also the relative lack of centralization and sort of itinerance of a court that, albeit the practice was actually still there, also for more developed national monarchies like the one of France and also the English one, was accentuated by again the lack of sort of a lot of pre-existing public institutional structures for how they had developed in parts essentially of post-Roman Europe and or in regions that had undergone a substantial level of development. Naturally, this, of course, in the West, Europe and Mediterranean overlaps with the Roman world, but you know that Germany is fundamentally in between, right? Western and Southern Germany, there are, as we will see now, in fact, the ones in which the German monarchy was fundamentally based in the centuries, and so also the most important of the Middle Ages in this monarchic sense, were in fact the Rhineland, Southern Germany, so on the right bank of the Danube, and this was somehow obvious, right? But the problem with this aspect of the German royal fisc lays mostly in the documentation of the same. That is to say, for these eras, like it's not, of course, even easy to do so for more developed monarchies in Western Europe. You can imagine in an area that, as we will see now, had already just in what we call public and institutional, a very heavy degree of privatization, in spite of the best efforts of especially the Hohenstaufen to invert the traditional trend, we could say, and therefore concentrating power as much as possible. We'll see today also part of that sort of rise and fall, if you want. It's very interesting. Now, at the peak of Salian power, at least before the investiture controversy, the level of support received by the ecclesiastical princes in Germany to the monarchy was essentially strong until, in fact, the investiture controversy, especially Worms, and made a video about the sort of feudalization of the episcopal investitures after that in Germany, began to decline, right, in the course of the 12th century. This was really normal. We've made videos recently just about the sort of the political and military highlights of all these various regions that were engulfed by significant warfare. I made a video about Henry V just recently, by the way, if you're interested in a bit seeing that dynamic from the late Salian perspective. And it's important to refer to the ecclesiastical princes because in all these monarchies, in all monarchies in Europe, in Christendom, basically the church had supported, importantly, the monarchical development, while the nobility tended to autonomize itself, and this could happen paradoxically still through reinforcement, co-optation, or oligarchization. So as in many countries, this would actually lead to actually a strengthening to the monarchy in the late Middle Ages. But at this point, especially, we're trying to remain more aside, more decentralized, because it was obvious in the High Middle Ages that, of course, monarchic power was increasing, and also the church didn't keep, and especially in Germany, to an important extent. The public structures, however, were present, right? The German monarchy did rely on its own fisc, right, the crown one, that fundamentally overlapped conceptually with, again, the Romano-Germanic public demand, right? And that was meant exactly, first of all, in this broadly meant Frankish, post-Frankish world, as a sort of private possession of the monarch. This is something that really emerged since Merovingian times, but technically was, again, mutuated by the Germanic rulers from the same Roman world, the same Roman institutions. This was, by the way, also a let's say a dynamic that was metaphysically seen as, reaching, of course, that level of absoluteness, considering that, especially in this case, the emperor had to rule all over the world. I mean, the investiture controversy had been fought over the same concept in some way, but of course, no king had ever had, or emperor had ever had, that full sort of proprietary control, right? In spite of what was claimed on such assets. And at this point, actually, the 12th, 13th centuries, considering that this was the peak of the Holy Roman Empire, and truly in the second half of the 12th century, Germany was the strongest power in Europe, we noticed that the fisc was substantially extensive and also considerably reorganized in ways we will see now, especially from the 12th century post-Worms crisis, right? The problem, as I said at the beginning, is that we do not clearly see and or understand what had happened before, meaning we start seeing how of course, public royal prerogatives had always been there, right, since Carolingian times, in some cases even before. But of course, the documentation regarding how this thing worked at a lower level between, say, the king and the counts is not really known. We start seeing it because we start getting the documents from the 12th, 13th century to reconstruct the system in a somewhat satisfactory way, depending on which standard you pick. In the past, we think that the management of the fisc, as well as the exercise of the comital office, had been somehow connected, right? Meaning that already, again, especially in Germany, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, the level of privatization, again, had always been substantially high. There had never quite been a true public authority who could say, well, I will simply rule over this. I mean, not even the Carolingians in the Western Frankish kingdom could really do that at any time. Everything was fundamentally clienterly and, say, public by name, but essentially private in nature, right? Which means that, of course, these counts had been subcontracted fiscal, the royal fisc. We say fisc, especially from Roman time, that means public authority. So whoever rules, the emperor, the king, assets, right? Just we do not understand, however, to which extent this was true. Of course, we think it was dramatically balanced in favor of the practical administration by the local counts, but institutionally it may have been regulated in ways that still today historiography debates on, right? Because it's many ways a matter of method. There are few sources. Things are not easy by definition. We see that by the beginning of the 12th century, the involvement of the counts with the fisc had basically almost disappeared, right? Because at this point, the public administration operated through the imperial ministeriales, right? We know who the ministeriales were this characteristic of German knighthood, right? That is to say, of non-freemen. These were technically serfs. And again, they stemmed from, in part, that same level of privatization I was saying before, from, say, times in which naturally the more north and east you go, you see slavery being there, etc. So this relation of personal liberty, etc., varied importantly. In Germany, you couldn't quite even, in this sense, as a ministerialis, even knock at the door of the greatest power to simply say, I would like to be freed, if it wasn't for the fact that, in fact, it was the same public authority that made a vast use of these guys, because their common, say, competitor were the lay nobility. Also, the ecclesiastical nobility when this began to behave in a sort of more princely fashion, also at some point betraying imperial authority. But we see this ministeriales installed fundamentally as castellans, magistrates, advocates, bailiffs. This practice had started, especially the militarization of these essentially non-free subcontractors had started in Ottonian times. We will see it better at some other point. And the objective, and they are the measure, this is the important thing, of the degree of actual public power in Germany. These were the iron arm of the Armstrong of the emperors, and also of the ecclesiastical princes most of the times. Exactly because they had to counter the nobiliar power. Again, because they were more aggressive, more warlike, they had their own free knights as well, etc. So the ministeriales, as you know, would grow as actually the majority of German knights, especially in southern Germany, the richest one, and from the one from which, in fact, especially the Swabian had prospered in the peak of German imperial power in the Middle Ages, right? So they were really important people, and again, there is a series that I made about them, and again, we will hopefully talk about them countless times more. However, given that, because you see, in high Middle Latin, ministerialis technically just means administrator, right? In Carolingian times, the ministeriales were just people like farmers, people who had subcontracted the administration of a place, right? In Germany, they take up this specific meaning as knights and institutional role. It's different in other. It's unique in Germany, actually, and compared to the other European lands. Except, again, we're not particularly documented about these ministeriales acting on the emperor's behalf until later in the 12th century. So everything it was before, 4 centuries, as a matter of fact, is not quite that known. Now, the Ottonian past had left some important mark. For example, in Eastern Saxony, that, as we've seen in those videos about Ottonian warfare when fighting especially against the Slavs on the Elbe, was, of course, a very important stronghold. It's the actual basis of Ottonian power, right? So that's where most of their power had concentrated through the same clienteles, etc. We realized that, at least in some parts of the region, of the province, fiscal management under vassal counts persisted much longer than elsewhere in Germany. Now, nobody really knows why. I have my own idea. Some historiographers say that this may have been, among the other things, the result of measures taken by Lothar III of Supplenburg after 1125. This was, as you know, we've seen also with Henry V, the Saxon opponent of the Salians. So it was the Salians themselves descended from the Ottonians in part, but let's say, as we will see now, the rivalry shifts, right? The center of power shifts between these rival centers, right? The Salians are in Franconia, the Hohenstaufen are in Swabia, so Saxony is ever more distant, right? But one idea of the reason why, of course, the vassal, there are multiple factors, of course. First of all, exactly what I just said, since the center of royal power distanced itself, of course, the Salians and the Swabians would have less capacity to enforce ministeriales as public authority in a place as distant as Saxony. All right. The other reason could be social in nature. That is to say, there may have been less stratification than we think, so that paradoxically the ministeriales as middlemen would have not been present, because the Saxon counts may have been actually similar to that, even in terms of political status or etc., like just as individual power, right? Northern Germany was poor, less stratified, so it's likely that it also maintained, especially at this point, like it's very early in time, this more primitive outlook, fundamentally. And just historiography does not quite come to a definitive conclusion as far as I know. Maybe the most updated one said something more substantial, but at least we have severe problems of reconstruction due to the lack of satisfactory resources on the topic. Now, the crown lands, of course, were present all across the country in order to, of course, remind the German princes of royal authority. And when we look at them, it's always very complicated to look at medieval maps in a sort of precise way, especially in Germany. It was so fragmented, but mostly for the fact that you cannot quite represent a level of power that sometimes extended itself just even nominally or just in deterrence, right? So it's not like a 19th century Victorian map, right? But we see the German royal crowns scattered actually quite broadly across especially the center and south of the German kingdom, what we were saying before. This does not wholly exclude the eastern dimension. Especially the eastern marches had been developing in a bit even of an anti-Saxon function, because Saxony was more, the Dutch also made a video about it, was more powerful than them, and so in order to escape this centripetal force, this eastern marcher lords began to side with the emperor. Right, this is also what Thuringia did, etc. Saxony was somehow dangerous, right? So there was a way wherever you had wherever the king, the emperor, depending on whether he had been crowned in Rome or not, would get support. Of course, depended on how much trouble again the local vassals really were. It's a bit the same concept of the ministeriales. The weaker you are, the more you tend to side with public authority against the oligarchs. All right. We see, however, and this is typical, of course, of the Middle Ages, but again, even more of the German case, an important degree of hybrid between these, let's say, the administration of these crown lands and the ones of the dukes, the landgraves, and the Count-palatine, because it doesn't matter how many supporters, clients you had as a king in those lands, still they sided with you because, again, local contingental factors. It's not that you could simply come to ruling to their land. So what would practically happen is that these guys were simply sharing or enfeoffing the royal crowns. They were enfeoffed too, right? And they shared the royal crowns, crown lands that, in fact, the sovereign would allow them to, right? Because it's the same identical concept through which any clientery mechanism in the Frankish world, broadly meant, had occurred always. Right? It was never a moment in which the kings could literally say, well, now I will enfeoff you into that land because I simply put you there. Unless, I don't know, you just confiscated them because of some sort of war. But in any case, even when that is over, that guy is remaining there. There is not much you can do to dislodge him. It's a sort of fully prepaid military service that this guy owes you as the public authority, but how this public authority can make leverage eventually to receive it depends mostly on this sort of much more intricate political balances that form exactly to exploit what is at the end of the day an important level of fragmentation and institutional weakness. At this point, as we've seen also through the ministeriales, etc., you realize there is a coming back generation, especially with the Swabians, after Worms and the initial shattering of royal authority that still is working, however, on a sort of very feudal basis, right? When Barbarossa takes power in Germany, he basically he renounces to trying to establish a public state, like, I don't know, the Ottonians had sort of dreamt of by Byzantine influence, where, you know, in the East things worked in dramatically different ways, because it was a more centralized system. Barbarossa enhances this by using feudalism as gluing factor, making oligarchs more powerful but co-opting them, right? And still having, as an oligarch himself, fundamentally, the strong power of the ministeriales. by importing Western Frankish feudalism, right, importantly enough, and especially in these western and southern regions rather than else. But this doesn't mean that, in fact, also in the most advanced regions of Germany, just there was less of a hybrid, right, with royal authority. It was pretty much everywhere. For example, in Bavaria, it seems that the local duke and the German king exercised joint lordship over manors, castles, and ministeriales. We do not see it so limpidly and for the entire Bavaria, but it's kind of obvious because, again, as any vassal, the ministeriales could be in part rendering service to a lord and in part to the king, and this is true for the management of manors, castles, etc. In Swabia, the Dukes of Zähringen held Zurich. It was a very strategical center, together with its surroundings, as a great imperial fief. We are as early as 1098, right? And the Dukes of Swabia also received themselves from the sovereign Ulm around the same time. Consider that this was also the moment of sort of Swabian, let's say, of the rise of the Hohenstaufen, in as much as they supported the failing Salian monarchy, and so they also married into the line and began to rise ever more to power with these prerogatives. I made a video that explains the difference between duchy and dukedom in Lotharingia and in Swabia. At this point, it explains how, of course, the local, it's not much the dukes as such, but properly the nobility of Swabia, as well as other provinces, held some sort of sense of the honor of, and so the prerogatives essentially of the local nobility, right, that they applied to the ducatus, the duchy, and that also, in fact, the very Hohenstaufen, even when they were emperors and controlling an enormous amount of territories in Europe and Mediterranean, still were to, say, oblige and to sort of be traditionally, customarily obsequious towards. Also because sort of applied to their own personal possessions as well, as they were Swabian lords, aside from being just Swabian dukes, so they had their own estates there, etc. The Count-palatine of the Rhine, being historically the heirs of the Lotharingian Counts-palatine in the 11th century, also maintained an important level of control over counties in the lower Rhineland. It was not as much as back in the day, but still, right? These rights appear to have originated over parts of the royal fisc that were subsequently unveiled, and so just like in the normal mechanism in the Norman proceedings, right? These connections seem to have been survivals of earlier arrangements stretching forward into the 12th and the 13th century, by the way. So throughout this time, of course, we realized that there wasn't any major fracture in these political and institutional dynamics. Germany was, like other countries, flourishing through essentially developing the same institutions it had always been relying, right, at least recognizably in the previous centuries. So aside from the lack of documentation, we can't sort of see the pattern, we can't see the trend. At the time of the Hohenstaufen, royal fisc was naturally a bit like at its peak in absolute terms, and this was not really that easier to handle, right? Because, especially towards the decline of the Hohenstaufen, as long as you see these dynasties, historically, these powers, whichever they were, they could expand very much, but then they would contract at a point. And so if they had de facto also maintained say a control over royal fisc de facto as a private house on their own, when the private house declined, this royal fisc was out there to be captured, right? And so the erosion of public rights, when you read that, is fundamentally the occupation of these estates, the simple recognition, as we will see now by the local communities, vassals, etc., of other lords, and or properly also the destruction, like through war, through ravages, and more, right? So that that sort of positive mechanism, civilizationally, developmentally, that had seen in the previous centuries vassals, advocates, especially the ones of the church, because that the clergy could not administer capital punishment, so they needed these other supporters that were laymen or administrators, etc., were not quite that fashionable, right? What would happen is that the aristocracy would simply occupy those portions of the fisc, appropriating themselves of the same. This, the Hohenstaufen didn't quite suddenly eclipse with the end of Frederick II, but of course they had been sort of declining, and especially after 1245, when also just the imperial power in Germany was definitely declining. You can observe it through the many imperial ministeriales. These were holding office over the fisc, as we've seen, and so they gradually began to accept, simply, by the way, new lords amongst the princes who were, most of the cases, the more immediate neighbors, right? This brought properly a process of fragmentation and or redrawing of the major assets and whoever, say, of the dynasties that controlled them. Notoriously, after Frederick's son Henry, German rebellion, the emperor had come from Sicily into the country and had issued the edictum in favorem principum. That is a bit like, not the actual collapse of Hohenstaufen power, but basically a very important mean of policy shifting, because basically now, consider the 13th century as the peak also of feudalism as just as an institution. The same Stupor Mundi decided that it was better to sell public rights. This is what the edict in favor of the princes, that's what the title means in Latin, would be sold to these guys in exchange for literal money, wealth, whatever, so that the Swabian house could basically build its own. The project was building a sort of super state between Swabian Austria, so they would completely control the Alpine passes. The Babenberg were about to say that everybody was trying to grab the Babenberg estates, were the envy, right, of Germany in terms of development. I explained this in the video about the Duchy of Austria, but we will come back on it, because that's a very important chapter. That's also how what brings the Swabian Habsburgs to go over to the eastern part of the German kingdom, etc. And all things we have already seen here and there, but it's always fascinating just to recall a little bit to make further glue and referencing you other videos I made. So this this is as simple as that, right? The local ministeriales that were at this point, by the way, also disappearing legally, juridically, meaning that they were starting, by the 14th century, there wasn't much of a difference between German knights, right? The ministeriales in some cases had become even more powerful than some noble knights. There were so many, and so this juridical distinction in the face of their wealth and power was just senseless, right? So that's why it simply disappeared. Many of them enter in crisis because, of course, with the rise of the princes, there were some ferocious policies. That's hence all the German mercenary companies of the 14th century. Where did they come from? Well, in part from this social institutional mechanism and the general crisis, just generally speaking, that was occurring politically and more. Hence, it all makes sense, right? You see how basically every European country works in different ways, yes, but also towards similar direction. They all have their own way for the same thing, same dynamic. This is also a point by the mid-13th century, as was hinting at before, that when bishops began to sort of behave like any other nobleman. All right, the sense was that yes, the monarchy, the empire had been a good thing, and this would remain some sort of the prerogative of the German Federation, etc. But they began to pursue their own policies and not backing the ruling houses necessarily anymore. I mean, some would keep doing that, and there was always a continuity in that too. But now it depended way more on the circumstances. I made a video about this, the one about the rise of Philip of Swabia and Otto of Brunswick, that makes you see especially how the electorate of Cologne, the most important, was there essentially drifting away from royal support in general. The dukes of Bavaria were also benefiting a lot from this, the Count-palatine of the Rhine as well. And in this case, it was because they were the heirs of Conradin, right, the last of the Swabians. They were essentially his nearest surviving relations, and so in part they would be able to inherit some Swabian legacy, aside from the Habsburgs that naturally did at the end of the interregnum something much more precise, and they were actual Swabians themselves. So the princes and the crown had also arranged mutually advantageous exchanges of property. Right, this was true especially in this mechanism of power concentration of on a territorial basis. You could have all these crown lands scattered across the empire, but at some point, given that that process of national monarchy was failing, even the ruling houses decided that it was better to concentrate these crown lands into their own ancestral domains or regions of origin. For example, in 1158, Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, gave to his cousin, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the castle of Badenweiler in Swabia, with substantial amount of lands, and the concomitant homages of 800 ministeriales, which had come into his possession, by the way, by 1149, and received on that occasion as the dowry of his first wife, Clementia of Zeringen. Now, this is fascinating because you see how essentially ministeriales switched property literally in the process. But here you have the opposite of what we were saying, because as you'll see, the same thing was done by the same sovereigns. But here you have a Duchy of Saxony that basically sells right to his cousin and emperor that is based in Swabia his this castle, right, with lands, with ministeriales, so that the latter could compact, in fact, a territorial power also far away, right? This is the context, like that. At this point, Henry controls Saxony and Bavaria, loosely, of course. Frederick fundamentally Franconia and Swabia, equally loosely. And you have the sort of two axes of two different, also cultural areas of Germany, right? That, in fact, had always somehow been conflicting, even within the same monarchy, as we've seen on multiple occasions, will keep being. Conversely, Henry the Lion, as in fact established in Saxony, would try to compact properties there. Specifically, he was interested in imperial fortresses of Herzberg, Schwarzfels, and Pölten that had all some assets attached to them, and essentially his cousin Frederick gave him the latter in exchange for the Badenweiler castle, right? So to mutual benefit, to say the least. and the Duchy of Saxony could simply compact more on the basis of this possession. Another interesting example is ecclesiastical. In 1166, the Archbishop of Magdeburg, Wichmann, gave up, renounced, to the rich possessions of Schönberg and Oberwesel as a lord. These regions were on the Rhine, by the way, so Magdeburg is on the Elbe. The Rhine, of course, is on the other side of the country, so that tells you also the range, of course, of these possessions and the power of these aristocracies on a territorial basis. And in exchange for that, the emperor at the time was the same Frederick Barbarossa, gave the bishop the Abbey of Nienburg, as well as the castle of Freckleben, that were in Saxony, in fact. So what does this bishop do? He gives away, basically, the Rhineland possessions that were sort of closer, of course, to the Hohenstaufen, and he gets some other stuff in Saxony, where he was. In any case, in the latter example is not the end of what occurred, because Frederick II, basically this is after he rose to power, right after all the struggle with Otto of Brunswick, etc. Basically sent this Rhineland properties back. Gave back this property to Magdeburg, to the Archbishop, in fact in 1216, right? And from the 30s of the same 13th century, these properties became once again part of the German royal fisc. So you could have a lot of back and forth, and these lands, of course, were lordships specifically. So you could have a lordship on a land that increased or decreased in value for whichever strategic, political, patrimonial reason, right? So it would be that easy, so sort of give and take. And it was that fluid, really. This is evident also considering how unstable, say, how politically changing the climate was between civil wars, etc. How much did the German princes, as privates, really familiarize with the royal fisc, right? What kind of relation existed between them and the emperor regarding to these possessions? Well, one of the most important features about the crown possessions were, of course, the palaces, right? You know that in medieval times, and especially in the High Middle Ages, north of the Alps, it was a huge deal to have like a palace built in stone, right? And the palace had been uninterruptedly since Roman times the only center of power, right? The palace, the palatium, represented that and that on public authority, sovereign authority, and the emperors had different royal courts held in such residences. For obvious reasons, given that it had been founded by Charlemagne as the northern Rome, the most prestigious of these royal palaces was the one of Aachen. Right, Aachen was not that important in this period. Like, it was just extremely symbolic and prestigious. That's where fundamentally the kings of the Romans were crowned. You know, so this was normally the German rulers were crowned kings of Germany in places like Frankfurt, Mainz, etc. Or in fact, but they would take the title of would-be emperor before the Italian expedition as kings of the Romans in Aachen, right? Exactly to stress the Carolingian legacy. Frederick Barbarossa was particularly sensitive to this topic. He really identified this continuity between him, Charlemagne, Otto I, and re-embellished very much Aachen, the palace, the church, etc., and essentially conceived it as the quote-unquote seat of the empire. Right? Otherwise, there wasn't, as you know, a real capital in Germany, nor Aachen technically served as one. because hardly any monarchy at this point had something like a real capital. But of course, again, England was a very old center of power. Paris still was. Germany didn't quite have much of this. It had important cities, but they were always subjected to princely power that was based on the countryside, and the sort of feudal rural dimension was sort of more habitual, even just for nets of powers and so on, right? But some of these fortifications naturally were massive, etc. Just they weren't only cities. There were naturally other coronation sites in the empire, mainly in Italy, obviously enough. So wherever they would get the Iron Crown, it was propedeutic to the Roman one. If you didn't have that, you couldn't quite become emperor. So we're talking usually of Pavia, or either Milan or Monza. I mean, just it's that triangle. And in the Kingdom of Burgundy, that was rarely visited by the German rulers, but had in Arles especially a great center of sort of prestige, of Romanity, of say that properly the imperiality of the Kingdom of Burgundy was there. There wasn't such a thing in Bohemia, because that was sort of more ethnically guarded, let's say, but it was also less relevant, telling you the truth. I mean, Burgundy was, again, so Italy was, of course, crucial for the imperial authority. Many of the royal palaces, by the way, were newly built or restored or extended during the 12th century, which is also from we know it archaeologically, architectonically, in fact, the moment in which really massive stone buildings are coming back, right, in Europe to be regularly built. And so the German Empire, the peak of its power, would, of course, reinforce the ones that already existed, because, of course, there was always some sort of palace, right, or even if it wasn't so particularly representative, but any center had a place where the emperor could go, right? So that was also part of the crown possessions, by the way. So this is kind of obvious. We can measure, in fact, through this 12th century rebuilding, expansion, its restoration, a discrete level of prosperity of the German crown. Right, we understand they had the resources, even though we do not really know how to track them historically, to document and highlight them. These resources are definitely displayed. So it means that the system, doesn't matter how, again, messy the institutional ensemble of Germany was, still the German kings did have the means and the resources that would be provided to them through most of these crown lands imaginable. Some of the palaces had naturally also a lot to do with the rebirth of cities. There were very important centers. We mentioned Frankfurt, that became a quite prosperous city, but also Nuremberg, Goslar. So again, places actually scattered a bit all across the kingdom, because technically, even if, as we've seen, the patrimonial possessions of the ruling house were mostly concentrated in their own ethnic territory, of course the sovereign ruled because he held court in many different places across the country, and of course there was nothing bad, even with competitors, to just have the king there negotiating and whatever, right? So of course this itinerancy was part of the way in which the same sovereigns could rule. As we were saying before, however, there were some country residences that played a bit the same role. For example, the castle of Gelnhausen in the lovely valley of the Kinzig River, that turned essentially as a hunting lodge for Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. There was an impressive sandstone palace built at XI-XIII, located in a wooded hill country. It had a huge fish pond, still in the 12th century in terms of natural resources, meant really a lot. There was also an adjoining deer park that again was the prerogative of the nobility. Forests in Germany really had an enormous political, institutional importance. Royal forests that, as you know, sometimes were not technically forests, sometimes were just moors, some parks broadly meant, were one of the most important assets of the public domain, typically in the early Middle Ages, because swine breeding, again, wood, all these sort of resources, fishing, right, hunting, etc., were jealously controlled by the nobility. When some brigand hit there, right, especially in this German context, we have quite interesting letters saying, if you don't get out there, we will come there, we will cut you to pieces, and these people would leave. And Germany was naturally still at the time, actually still very heavily forested, right? It hadn't been that much colonized, deforested, reclaimed. Say, like, of course, it would happen in a couple of centuries. You know that the ethnic lands were at times separated geographically and historically by forests, this very large, thick forests that had literally separated these peoples throughout the ages. So it was very important to have a grip on those two. Patterns of princely politics also affected the fisc, the palaces, in other ways. For example, in the 10th century, when you look at that aforementioned richest agglomeration of royal lands in eastern Saxony, close to the border, because they launched the military expeditions from there to the east to south, and in spite also of its erosion in later times, a Swabian chronicler tells us that at the beginning of the 70s of the 11th century, that agglomeration of royal lands still literally fed the court, right? Because according to this author, the province had been literally assigned to be the emperor's kitchen. Now this is fascinating because if you look at the parallel, say, 12th century Komnenian households, you realize that Crete as a whole had basically been the garden of the for which the actual food would be sent to the Komnenian Okeaka in Constantinople. So there were important territorial logistical implications of these royal lands. Consider that the royal prerogatives historically revolved around the necessity of waging war. The famous Faldrum, the sense that the roads, the bridges, all the public major strategic assets of one country were fundamentally public for that security reason, right? Maintaining an army on the march. So these had to be fruitful assets that could and would keep providing this wealth, right? So definitely not passive ones, and ones for which, in fact, as we have seen through the ministeriales and other officials, were worked and improved, etc. The shift really from Saxony to the west, the southwest, occurs especially with the fall of the Salians that had kept using, as we've seen, up to the investiture controversy, Saxony and this royal crown lands there to literally feed their own court. And after Worms, we know, through the Bishop Otto Freising, the recognition that the great resources of the German kingdom were actually in the upper Rhineland, right? So probably southwestern Germany by that point, right? We can't explain now how Saxony had become so important, historically, but let's say it had not been because it was the most developed area in Germany, definitely, and it is a matter of how rulers decide to rule from and through which patrimonial rights, through which general policy internationally, etc. So you can have shifts in the actual center of power independently from the actual productivity, absolute productivity of a region that, as we've seen as such, was never like fully under imperial control, right, or royal control. So the composition of the fisc, and therefore the main residences that were upon it, showed a marked shift towards the south, as it's notorious, when the Swabians were rising to the throne with Conrad III in 1138, and so that would historically maintain the palm of also the more developed era. Another important role played in the German royal fisc were the towns with their imperial protection and privileges. As you know, this was a particularly prominent feature in the German kingdom, specifically the Freie Reichsstädte. They essentially emerged as just from this high medieval town development, but differently from the Italian communes that eventually evolved into city-states with their own imperially recognized privileges at some point, that were depending on the same emperor to receive instead in Germany these rights, right? In Germany, you don't have something like the city managing to create a territorial state like in the Italian kingdom. As soon as they step outside the city gates, there was a prince, whether ecclesiastical, layman, and that was who ruled in Germany on a regular basis. But, right, of course, the towns had their own specific and strategic value, which, as we've seen, was also connected with royal palaces and so on, and so providing this still sort of again weaker centers, as we've seen before, the ministeriales, the church, all people that feared the bigger lay princes. This was a way to gradually again obstacle the latter, and let's say maintaining sort of a greater control in the kingdom, right? Some privileges would be at some point conferred even after the collapse of the national monarchy, and it was just a way to avoid, I don't know, another lord, another house to emerge into a specific area. But overall, like the cities wouldn't go that far by themselves, that we've seen for the late Middle Ages, where some leagues, the Swabian one, the Rhineland one, but albeit they even managed at some point to win a battle or so, they were eventually subjected to princely power anyway, right? So it's mostly a phenomenon stemming from the dramatic fragmentation of the kingdom rather than specific capacity of these centers to rise. Without mentioning that the same emperors were not overwhelmingly happy of certain centers to simply rise to unrestrained power, right? For different reasons. For example, Cologne at some point managed to expel the bishop, that however maintained still a vast seigneurial territory all around the city. This could give problem to the elective systems and all this stuff, because of course the seat of the bishop was within the city after all, the cathedral, etc. So there were these kind of problems. Furthermore, in Germany, rulers did not culturally conceive what they found, in fact, south of the Alps, that is to say, essentially free communes that were dictating law to imperial vassals, right? So literally commoners dictating rule to the nobility. Say the rise of the towns, the commoners, etc., was traditionally seen as just a negative thing within the same Germany, and so of course the highest nobility, doesn't matter which games they were playing in order to maintain power, etc., but they were just opportunistically confer protection and privileges, but not because they liked the commoners and the third estate, right, as such. Of course, then there were some, we've seen it also for the Kingdom of France, there were some sort of intersections, even in culture, in style, and sort of courtesy. The patriciate was important, etc. But again, German towns are more modest than sort of the top city-states in Europe, generally speaking. Kings were thus tempted on the longer run to still back, paradoxically, other noblemen, and in particular the bishops, right? Because they were, after all, especially towards the late Middle Ages, not so dangerous, right? You don't have a major ecclesiastical power that can truly pursue a regional power policy, right? Just the papal states could do something like that overall, because they were a real conglomeration, but also that was pretty disorderly. In Germany, you have pretty big ecclesiastical principalities. They also have electoral power, as you know, in the cases of Cologne, Mainz, and Trier, but they're not real powers like different houses. I don't know, the Habsburgs, the Wittelsbachs, and the Luxembourgs, etc. So that's a different story. By that time, let's say the German episcopate had been somehow normalized politically, institutionally, and you could trust them also to maintain, in fact, the sort of control over the cities where their dioceses were, and having to cope with them, right? Because these communities were not passive, as we've seen, but also they were limited in power. So as long as they could balance each other, the monarchy was okay with that. The royal court did generally, however, have still an option, like a habit, a history of preferring subordinate townsmen, right? Because at some point they were so, say, harmless that they could simply be used as officials. For example, in 1226, the emperors broke the first League of Cities in the Rhineland that consisted in Mainz, Bingen, Worms, and Speyer, and these ones consisted in bishop towns specifically, but there were also, next to this, trying to associate 3 fiscal cities, and also a pretty big one, that is Frankfurt, together with Gelnhausen and Friedberg. So, albeit the royal crown shared the prince's qualms about the rise of towns. I say royal crown because, of course, it was the imperial one, and it's superimposed, but this was specifically about the German kingdom. The rise of florid town markets upon the same crown lands was an advantage, after all, right? If they could be kept down, but they prospered, and again, they were important trade centers on major rivers. They had this just even infrastructural, right, importance, right? They would be quite relevant, especially for supplying the royal armies. This is a factor you can see also, I don't know, in Vienna, when Ottokar II takes over from Bohemia, or the later Habsburgs. The third estate, the bourgeoisie, let's say, was essentially gaining, as a local patriciate, more power, and essentially making these towns becoming more oligarchic from the within, so that actually the commoners as a whole wouldn't quite benefit it, aside from a few patricians over time. But they were doing so by providing with what the markets could give. Like, cities were rising because they could concentrate all this wealth, supplies, fodder, think about all the crafts, all what could be produced for arms, armor, the horses, equipment, wagons. They were just specialized in that sort of business of moving stuff, right, in large quantities, and logistically in war That's quite the key, right? So this had naturally been always the case, as we were saying before, for every community that was always having to give something to the emperor, especially for military expeditions. This is true even in the Peace of Constance, when the Lombard League, the Italian communes are recognized with specific privileges. Of course, the same communes were fine saying, yes, traditionally we owe you the faldrum, etc., but that's it, right? For basic public means. Otherwise, that, by the way, the emperor would not even always be able to use, especially if he was not crossing Italy. But it was so traditional, so basic, so historically connected to public authority that it was kind of normal. Nobody was really complaining about that. And it's evidently in this period quite eloquent that Frederick Barbarossa would wage so many and ultimately unsuccessful wars against the Lombard cities that evidently were even more profitable to subject than the German ones. At least they literally invaded this region. So, of course, telling the truth, here we're talking mostly about Germany. If we were to read this also in a more institutional way, of course, the emperor as such, not the German king, had a lot, right, of to claim from the Italic, the Burgundian, even the Bohemian cities, right, besides the German ones, right, and there is territorially a specific connection, for example, between the Hohenstaufen and even before Frederick Barbarossa's expeditions, the Swabian, but also the Lombard cities, in terms of which are those cities that really pay to us something. We have lists of this, right, and you realize that even the same Lombardy considered itself just like bordering, as it did, Swabia, in a way that they were sort of habituated to cooperate in that to some degree, even when the emperor was not south of the Alps. So this is particularly relevant, I would say. And obviously when the king levied a tax in Germany, was also paid by these towns. We have a tax list surviving from 1241, and generally speaking, there is really a lot to tell that today we can't quite simply do in depth, but it makes you think about how the system concretely worked, because when you want to know where did they find the money, the resources, that's how it worked, right? So we literally don't know how it worked in detail because it's not documented, but it's obvious that the mechanism relied on this sort of constant competition that existed between different estates, different individuals, different houses that had all, say, this or that interest in terms of whether to follow royal policy or not, right? This is particularly relevant because it brings to a quite specific sense of how you can rule over a country if you have. This is a story that ends, of course, in failure, but over time. But considering that prior level, in fact, of difficulty, of lack of power concentration, etc., you realize, after all, how effective it really was. There is a historiographical debate concerning the sort of divergent direction that Germany took compared to France, England. Some people said that essentially by the 12th century there was nothing specifically, let's say, different, say in general, essential terms, between the German monarchy, institutionally speaking, and how in its robustness, right, and say the French or the English one. I disagree on this, telling the truth, because it's not a matter of how. There are lots of historians who basically stop to say normative history, as we have seen here, we don't actually have quite clearly depicted how much, like, even the monarchs were getting from this, from these resources, right, from these assets. The point is not that. The point is how progressed was the sense of monarchic, sort of oligarchic, concentrated, institutionally established power in these lands. And Germany had definitely a more centrifugal system, much less public one historically, than, say, countries like France or even England, right? And the reasons are deep. It's not just about the surface, right? How much they could equilibristically gather as surplus, right? It's also, which was risky business also in the more established monarchies, but tendentially, right, you see a pattern in Western Europe that differs from Central Europe, right? Old Central European monarchies essentially failed. They became elective, and at some point the state collapsed, and some other power hegemonized them. In the case of Germany, we look at the Habsburgs or the Hohenzollern throughout the modern age that basically rule from more land outside of Germany than within Germany, and it doesn't even come close to the majority of the land. And in this sense, this is true for the other Central European monarchies. So in the West, you don't find this. You find difficulties, struggles, civil wars, but within the wake of a pre-established sense of monarchical affirmation. Germany just didn't have that. They had emerged as sort of separated ethnic chunks. Doesn't matter how Germanic they were. That doesn't mean German necessarily. So even though that thing did exist, it was not present in the same national monarchic amount that we see in those other Western European monarchies. This is particularly important to stress, right? And different destinies, different histories, but one cannot unsee that, let's say. But you understand also that every country had its own balance, its own sort of power, wealth distribution, and sort of power dynamics as a consequence. For today, however, I stop it here. We'll keep talking about this topic, of course, because it's, as you understand, it's a bit the most important in the German Middle Ages. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I always thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.